welcome to our final message in our series, Wherever You Go, Exploring the World of Prayer. And for those of you who are watching online today, I'm so glad you've joined as well. My name is Carolyn, and I'm the pastor of care here at Riverwood. Well, we've covered a lot of territory this summer as we've journeyed through the Old Testament and New Testament, exploring the prayers prayed by people who have gone before us. And this suitcase, it has also traveled to a variety of locations, places like the Selkirk Rodeo Grounds, the Broadway Bridge in Saskatoon, in Ottawa at the War of 1812 Monument, and this past Friday, the Mall of America in Minneapolis. And congratulations to all of those who were a part and played in this contest on Instagram and on Facebook. And congratulations to the winners who guessed the location of the suitcase. Well, today we're picking up this suitcase again, and we are heading to the land of Uz. Now, that is not to be confused with the land of Oz. Uz is a real place. Oz was a fictional place. Uz was and is in current modern-day Jordan. And while we're there, we are going to visit a man named Job. Then, after we come back from Uz, we are going to go all the way back to North America here, and we are going to stop in Colorado, and we are going to visit a woman named Lisa. Now, these will be very quick stopovers, but we will end back here, and we will explore one of the age-old questions, a question I've asked in my life, and I'm sure that you have asked too. All right, are you ready to go on this journey? Let's go. As we stop in Uz, we meet Job. Now, Job was a man who had it all. He was the multi-millionaire, so to speak, of his area. And the author who bears his name in the book of Job in the Bible, he measures Job's wealth according to the size of his herds. So the Bible says Job had 7,000 sheep. Now, that was a lot of sheep, and it meant that he and his family and many others would have enough wool for clothing plus food to eat. Job had 3,000 camels, and that meant most likely that he had a camel transport business on the side. He had 500 teams of oxen. Can you imagine how many fields he would be able to plow with that many oxen? And he had 500 female donkeys, and that was a big deal because donkey milk was a delicacy of the day, and there was a lot of money in donkey milk. But Job wasn't just a man of wealth. He had a family, a wife, 7 sons, 3 daughters, and it sounds like they were a close-knit family. His children were growing, but they still loved hanging out together. They would take turns having the whole family over to their homes for dinner parties. Job loved his kids, and he would pray for them. In fact, he would offer sacrifices to God on their behalf just in case they had crossed over some line into sin. He wanted them to be right with God. And the Bible says Job was a man who was blameless. He was a man of integrity. In fact, he says that he made a covenant with his eyes that he would not look with lust upon another woman. Job was completely devoted to his wife in every way. Job had a wonderful life, wonderful that is, until that catastrophic week when he and his wife lose it all. Job describes the after effects of his loss with these words: "I cannot eat for sighing. My groans pour out like water. What I always feared has happened to me. What I dreaded has come true. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest. Only trouble comes. And he says this of God: I go east, but he's not there. I go west, but I cannot find him. I do not see him in the north, for he is hidden. I look to the south, but he is concealed. I long for the years gone by when God took care of me, when he lit up the way before me and I walked safely through the darkness. When I was in my prime, God's friendship was felt in my home. The Almighty was still with me, and my children were around me. And Job prays this prayer: I cry to you, O God, but you don't answer. I stand before you, but you don't even look. Silence. Where is God in the midst of Job's suffering? And why is he seemingly silent? Okay, we're going to grab our suitcase again, and now we're going to go over to Colorado, and we're going to stop in and see Lisa. But before I introduce you to Lisa, I want to tell you a little bit about her son, Michael. I met Michael in 2008 in Swaziland, Africa. We were there on a vision tour, Todd and I, Pastor John and Kelly, and we were there to discover whether this would be a good option for us to partner with this mission organization that was caring for the vulnerable children and the orphaned children who were so impacted by the AIDS epidemic at that time. So we were at this gathering, and Michael was there. And before we had dinner together, we had a conversation with Michael. He was a 14-year-old American boy who had moved to Swaziland the year before with his parents and 5 siblings. They were working with the organization that we would potentially be partnering with. And it didn't take long in the conversation for us to discover that Michael was an exceptional 14-year-old kid. He was outgoing. He could talk to all the adults. He was bright. And we could tell he had a heart for the vulnerable children of Swaziland as much as the adults who worked there. That was Michael. We had an opportunity to meet his parents a few evenings later. And after returning home from Swaziland, I was so impacted by the ministry there, which we have now been a part of for 15 years as a church. And I was impressed with Michael and with his family. And so I began to follow and read his mom, Lisa's blog. They moved back to Colorado a couple years after we had met, and this year, Lisa published a book called All the Sacred Things. Lisa became a widow at the age of 25 with 2 little girls, a toddler and a preschooler. I can't even begin to imagine how horribly hard that would be for this 25-year-old woman. 5 years later, she met Gary, and they got married, and they became a blended family. Lisa, a mom now to 3 sons, and Gary was a dad to her 2 little girls. Lisa describes her life as being one of great abundance. And she says that there has been even more significant loss. The loss of her first husband, of finances, of 2 unborn children, and then one day waking up to a parent's worst nightmare. Their middle son, Michael, this outgoing, bright, big heart, full of potential kid, was now a young adult, and he was in university in the States. Lisa describes Michael at age 19 as her little lost boy, as her son metaphorically wrapped in barbed wire. caught up in addiction. And then one April night in 2013, they received a phone call. Their beautiful son had jumped out of his university dorm window, already bloodied from a self-inflicted wound, and he died. Her words sound somewhat similar to Job's. She says, in the fallout of losing everything sacred to me, I was not okay. I was the walking dead. Sleep was a fairy tale. I scarcely remember what rest felt like. I had lost all hope. My husband's eyes were hollow as hopelessness overtook him. He saw himself as a failure at fatherhood, and I couldn't help him. He had a calling to father the fatherless, but now he was the father of a dead child and 5 others who were drowning in their pain. There was no absence of love in our marriage, yet we were locked in a cycle. We couldn't produce enough humility to fully squash down the anger and the pain. Lisa's deal with God had been, I'll fight for your children, God. I'll go all the way to Swaziland and I will fight for children. And you, God, you will protect mine. And she says, no matter how hard I prayed or wept, I could not reconcile all of this loss. Faith was stretched to the point of breaking. You only want to know that your most sacred things are safe from all that threatens to destroy them. Silence. Where is God in the midst of Lisa's tragic losses? And why does he seem so silent? Why didn't he answer her many, many prayers that her son would break free from addiction, that he would live up to his amazing potential? Oh, the heart-wrenching disappointment of unanswered prayers. Do you have an unanswered prayer today? Maybe it's a prayer that you've prayed for months. Maybe it's a prayer that you've prayed for years. And you can identify with Job's words of, oh God, why don't you answer me? Or maybe you find more similarities to Job than just his prayer. Maybe you can identify with his life, with Lisa's life, having multiple losses, and you are reeling from your situation and the prayers that were never answered for you. Today we're going to look at that age-old question, why doesn't God answer all of our prayers? I just finished reading an amazing book called God on Mute by Pete Greig. He's the co-founder of the 24/7 prayer movement, and many have said it is the best book that they have ever read on unanswered prayer. And so I ordered it, and I read it this summer. Pete writes this book both from personal experience, having watched his wife go through failing health, and at times he felt like God was silent. He was the founder of this 24/7 prayer movement, and yet he experienced silence. And he also writes from God's revelation about prayer in the Bible. And I found this book so incredibly helpful for my own questions regarding unanswered prayer that I would like to share with you today 3 of Pete's overarching reasons why our prayers might not be answered. Now, within these 3 categories that he gives that I'm going to share with you, there are actually a total of 12 possible reasons for us to take into account. But for the next few moments, I'm just going to name and briefly talk about these 3 overarching reasons. The first reason Pete gives for unanswered prayer is God's world. The reality is we live in a complex world. we're subject to the laws of nature, the way the world has been created. And we are also subject to a world filled with sin and sickness and sorrow. Was this God's original intent when he created the world and when he created people? Absolutely not. But because of his amazing love for each one of us, he decided to give people the option to believe him or not, to choose him or not. And when the first people, Adam and Eve, chose not to believe what God said and to do the opposite, sin entered the world. And we read about that fateful day in Genesis chapter 3, and humankind has been struggling ever since. Pete talks about one of his friends named Mike, whose daughter was born with a profound disability. And later, when Mike was just 32 years old, he was diagnosed with degenerative arthritis, which would affect his career as an outdoor pursuits instructor. Mike and his wife needed to relocate, but their house wasn't selling. And Pete asked Mike, "How do you cope?" And Mike said this, "I've realized that life is fundamentally tough. I used to think that I had some kind of divine right to happiness. And these days, I find it easier to just accept that life's tough, like they did hundreds of years ago before penicillin and flushing toilets, than to feel sort of hard done by, as if I've been robbed. Why blame God for stuff that's just the reality of life on a messed up planet?" Here's the thing, church. Jesus himself said, "In this world, you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world." In a sermon that he preached to a crowd of people on the side of a mountain, he said, "Don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Jesus' disciple Peter wrote these words in 1 Peter 4:12, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you." You know, when it comes to wondering why bad things happen, we must come to terms with the reality that we live in a broken world. A world full of trouble, a world of disease, of forest fires, of hurricanes, of floods, of sickness, and a whole pile of heartbreak, all due to the sin that came in at the very beginning. Lisa, who we met in Colorado, she says that she started to reframe her why question. Instead of asking, "Why me?" she said, "I now ask, why not me? Why should I be exempt from trouble?" But there is good news for followers of Jesus, a promise that we get to hang on to. With each of the declarations that Jesus and Peter made about us having trouble in this world, there's also a promise of what Jesus has done, or how our pain in life is not going to be wasted. And then one day Jesus is going to come to earth again, and he is going to make all things new. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away, it says in Revelation. We are living right now in the old order, but there is coming a day when God is going to make all things new. Well, the second overarching reason that Pete gives is God's will. Sometimes our prayers aren't answered because God has something even better for us, better than we can even imagine. And it's because of his love for us. Remember that prayer in Ephesians that Paul prayed, that we would understand, as all God's people should, how wide and long and high and deep his love is for us. But sometimes we question that love and we think we know what's best in a certain situation. However, God's will, his way, it's different than the human way. The prophet Isaiah gives us this message from God. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. But there are some things about God's will that we can know, and we can know this very moment beyond a shadow of a doubt. The Bible tells us that it is God's will that we would be close and in a close relationship with him, that he would be the one that we would allow to fulfill any void that we have in our lives, that he would be first. Pete writes, in God's kingdom, happiness is not marked out primarily by popularity, fat bank accounts, or clean bills of health, but rather by proximity to the Father. I think of the time when our youngest daughter, Carly, left home at age 18, and she did a 6-month adventure overseas, 3 months in Africa on a mission trip, and 3 months at a Bible school in Austria. Her first month away, she was in the country of Zambia. And in that country, at that time, in her mission trip, she didn't really know the people that she was traveling with. It rained every single day for 31 days. And Carly cried every single day for 31 days. She was able to FaceTime home once a week. They would go to the nearby town and get supplies and have internet access. And every time she would have tears, big tears streaming down her cheeks. And as a mom, it just really broke my heart to see her that way. God, please make things better for her, I would pray. But each week, it was the same story. Then, when Carly returned home, I asked her, which was your favorite month in Africa? Which of the 3? And much to my surprise, she said, Mom, it was the first month. And I thought, the first month? That was your favorite, when you cried every single day? When you were living in such unpleasant circumstances, when the weather was terrible and the ministry was hard and you didn't know anybody well? That was your favorite month? And she said, yeah, because it was in that month I learned to depend on Jesus. And in those 31 days, her faith grew exponentially. And it created such an incredible foundation for her future. You know, when I think of my own life, or I talk to other people and I ask, when do you feel like you were closest to God? When did you feel like you grew the most in your faith? And it's often in those very difficult experiences, because we are depending on God. So a couple of reasons for unanswered prayer may be God's will, God's world, or God's war. Now, this isn't God waging war. This is about the spiritual war between good and evil, about an enemy contesting the goodness of God's will all the time. Pete writes, of course, secular humanists laugh at the very notion of a cosmic battle featuring angels and demons. More disturbingly, there are skeptical voices within the Christian traditions, not just among 20th century liberals, but also among 21st century leaders. I attended one gathering of contemporary church practitioners at which a speaker admitted that he did not believe in the existence of demons. I appreciated his honesty in voicing what many people believe secretly. But I could not, and still cannot, see how such a position can be reconciled with a biblical worldview, let alone the witness of the world church and many of my own experiences too. I'd like to highlight a few places in the Bible that speak to this biblical worldview that we are in a spiritual war. One example is in Daniel chapter 10, where Daniel has an extraordinary encounter with an angel while praying one day. In verses 12 to 13, we read, "Then he said, he, the angel, 'Don't be afraid, Daniel, since the first day that you began to pray for understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your request has been heard in heaven, and I've come in answer to your prayer. But for 21 days, the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia blocked my way. Then Michael, one of the archangels, came to help me, and I left him there with the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia.'" This encounter gives us fascinating insight into the spiritual battle that we are in, and one reason why there may be a delay to our prayer being answered. And this is why perseverance in prayer is so important. We see this spiritual battle in the life of Jesus, whose public ministry began with an intense 40-day period of spiritual warfare in the wilderness, followed by periodic encounters with demons. Then in Ephesians, we're told that we too face a spiritual battle. It says, "For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." But because of what Jesus did on the cross, believers do not need to be overawed by our spiritual enemy, but we do need to be aware. Paul says in Ephesians 6, "Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so that you will be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil." So some answers to our age-old question of unanswered prayer may be just the natural effects of God's world, and that right now it is a broken world. Or it may be because of God's will. Or it may be because of the spiritual war that we are in and will exist until Jesus comes again. You know, there's so much more that Pete talks about in this book, and there's a 40-day devotional at the end to help people walk through their questions of unanswered prayer. And I have one book here today that I would like to give away. And if you would like this book, this is what I'd like you to do. Take out your phone, go to email, you can do this right now, and in the subject line, or first send it to me, carolyn@riverwood.cc, and in the subject line, write, "I want that book." And at the end of the service, now this is obviously only for people in the room, but at the end of the service, I will pick the 7th person in my email inbox, and we will give you that book. So we have heard some stories, we've come to some understanding, but what can we do practically when it feels like God is silent? And I'd like to give you 2 ways to respond. The first reason is pray through the pain. The Bible writers are incredibly honest about pain. In fact, they are more honest than we usually are. We saw that in Job's life when he prayed, "I cried to you, God, but you don't answer." 2/3 of the Psalms, the book of prayer in the Bible, are prayers of lament, expressions of grief and sorrow and anger and even doubt. Psalm 10:1 says, "Oh Lord, why do you stand so far away? Why do you hide when I'm in trouble? Oh Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day? I cry out to God. Yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven, but my soul was not comforted. I think of God and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for his help." If you feel like God is silent right now, talk to him about it. Follow the example of Job. Follow the example of the writers of Psalms. Even use the Psalms as your personal prayer time with God. Let's go back to Colorado and hear what Lisa says about how she coped during her times of excruciating pain and loss. She says, "Deep healing only came to me when I let God back in, and I started giving him the pain." Deep healing only came to me when I let God back in and started giving him the pain. She says, "I don't know what the future holds, but I no longer just look to myself for strength. I look only to the healer of the broken. And God is as present in the agony as he is in the innocent wonder. And God beckons you and I to come sit, rest, and trust in him." Pray through your pain. Bring your sadness, your anger, your fears to God, and don't give up. D.L. Moody, who is an American evangelist, he used to carry a list of 100 names of people in his life who didn't know Jesus, and he had such a burden for these people. And he would pray for them on a very regular basis. And when he died at the age of 62, 96 of those 100 people had become Christians. And the 4 remaining gave their lives to Christ at his funeral. Give God the pain. Pray through the pain. Don't give up. And secondly, shift the spotlight. You know, often and understandably so, we shine a spotlight on the situation we are going through because it's so invasive and it's so overwhelming. And we do need to be honest about that. However, in addition to the honesty, we must shift the spotlight from our pain, our situation, onto God's character and who he is. Even though we may feel like God is silent on a certain matter, he is not absent. He's not absent. When we stopped in on Job, we saw the magnitude of his loss. We listened to his gut-wrenching prayer of why, but we didn't stay there long enough to hear God's answer back to Job. And you know, sometimes that's like us. We give up so easily and we don't wait to listen to hear what God wants to say to us. But God does reply to Job, and here is what God says. "Who is it that questions my wisdom? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundation, and who laid its cornerstone as the morning stars sang together and the angels shouted for joy?" And God continues through the next few chapters, giving Job example after example of his power, of his creativity, of his knowledge, and of his wisdom. And then Job finally replies, and he says, "God, I know that you can do anything, and no one can stop you. You asked, 'Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance?' Well, it is I, and I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. You said, listen, and I will speak. I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. When life feels chaotic, when it feels out of control, when we are in despair, when we are tired of waiting for our answer to prayer, we must anchor ourselves in the truth that we are deeply loved and we are closely held by the most powerful being in the universe. Each psalm that I read earlier not only has words of emotion and questions that we can all identify with, they each also shift the spotlight on to God's character. Psalm 10 also says, Lord, you know the hopes of the helpless, and surely you will hear their cries and comfort them. He says, but I trust in your unfailing love in Psalm 13:5. Psalm 77, he says, but then I recall all you have done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They are constantly in my thoughts. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works. Hudson Taylor, who was a missionary to China in the 19th century, lost 58 fellow missionaries and 21 of their children on one horrific day during a rebellion in 1900. And at the height of the chaos, he said, I can't read right now. I can't think. I actually can't even pray. But I can trust. He shifted the spotlight from the situation onto who God is, and God was someone that he could trust. You know, often we want God to airlift us out of our situation, but so often God chooses to more or less parachute himself in and be present with us. I was really moved by the story of a Jewish man in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. And one of his duties was that he had to clean all of the toilets with his bare hands. And he knelt there, scrubbing away at the filth, and while he did this, the Nazi guard sought to humiliate him even further. He said, "Where is your God now?" And quietly, without removing his hands from the toilet, the prisoner replied, "He's right here with me in the muck." Friends, God is with you. He is with you. He is not absent. He is with you in the muck of your situation. Shift the spotlight from the muck onto God and who he is. You know, although Job experienced unimaginable loss, he shifted the spotlight onto God, and he experienced God in a fresh way, saying, "I've only heard about you before, God, but now I have seen you with my own eyes." Although Lisa lost so much in her life, she shifted her spotlight from her situation onto the healer of the broken. And she writes, the pain takes on different shapes, and at times it can only be seen as brilliantly tragic. But it's like when the sunrise appears, and it's so majestic that I question if I've even seen shades like that before. And then I wonder, was the sunrise created just for me? Clearly, I have not been abandoned by God. I'm sure every one of us today is waiting for an answer to a prayer. Remember that even if God seems silent, he is not absent. Pray through your pain, pray through the questions, and don't give up. And shift the spotlight from your situation onto God's character, his love, his faithfulness. You can trust him. In fact, he is right with you in the muck.